In the autumn of 1883, the Clearwater Basin in southern Montana Territory held two things in abundance: wind that never stopped and land that nobody wanted. The basin sat low between two ridgelines, sheltered from the worst of winter by a pine-choked shoulder of the Bitterroot foothills to the west. But the soil had been overgrazed by a decade of mismanagement, and the grass came in thin and pale. The ranches that had tried and failed in that basin were a matter of county record. The Alderton place had gone under in 1879. The Sutter operation collapsed 3 years later, its debts so tangled that the bank auctioned what remained in pieces. What was left of the Crail Ranch, 41 acres and a collection of failing structures at the end of a two-rut road, sat unsold for the better part of a year. No one drove out to look at it. No one thought it worth the trouble. Nora Voss arrived in the basin on a Thursday morning in October, her possessions in a single saddlebag thrown over the back of a borrowed gray gelding. She was 27 years old. She had $12.30 to her name, a bone-handled pocket knife, and a knowledge of carpentry so thorough she could tell the species of a beam by the way it smelled in damp weather. That last thing she had from her father, Edwin Voss, who had spent 30 years building houses and barns across 3 territories before his heart gave out in the summer of 1881. She had worked beside him from the age of 9. She knew how to read a wall the way other women her age knew how to read a parlor clock. The gray gelding was not hers. It had belonged to a horse trader named Packard in Miles City, who had taken one look at the chestnut mare Nora arrived with and offered the trade without much preamble. The chestnut had been her one inheritance, a sound animal and fast, and Packard had known it. He had also known that Nora needed cash more than she needed a fast horse, and so the trade had included $6 on top of the gray, who was older and slower and entirely reliable. She had taken the deal because she had no better one available. She reached the Crail place just before noon. The road turned off the main wagon trail and dropped into a low fold in the land, following a dry creek bed for a quarter mile before the structures came into view. There was a main house of squared log construction, a barn with a sagging ridgeline, a smaller outbuilding, and the bunkhouse, which sat apart from the others on slightly higher ground to the east, separated from the barn by a distance of perhaps 60 feet. A hand-lettered notice from the county land office was nailed to the main house door, weathered to near illegibility. Nora sat the gray horse at the edge of the yard for a long moment and looked at all of it. The structures were not collapsed. That was the first thing, and it mattered. A building that still stood could be fixed. A building that had gone to the ground was something else entirely, a salvage problem rather than a repair problem. And salvage took resources she did not have. The barn ridgeline concerned her, but she could see from the yard that the walls were plumb. The main house roof showed dark staining above 2 of the lower windows where water had tracked in. Probably a flashing failure at the chimney rather than a structural problem. The bunkhouse was the most intact of the 4 structures. Its roof was sound, its logs well seated. Its single window still held its glass. It was, by a measure she could not quite name yet, the building that interested her most. She dismounted, tied the gray to a fence post, and walked the property for an hour before she did anything else. If you have ever stood inside a building that has been empty for years, you know the particular quality of that silence. It is not simply the absence of sound. It is the presence of accumulated time, pressing outward from the walls. Nora had stood inside such buildings many times, following her father with a measuring rod and a notebook while he assessed what could be saved. She understood that a building remembered what had happened inside it in the way that wood remembered the tree it had come from, in grain and ring, and the faint mineral record of the water it had drawn up across its years. Edwin Voss had taught her to carry that understanding, the way a doctor carries a stethoscope. not as an occasion for display, but as a quiet instrument that told the truth about a thing when pressed close to it. She walked the perimeter of the property first, reading the fence line. It had been good work at its construction, the posts seated deep and the wire strung true, but two stretches on the north side had gone slack where the posts had shifted in a wet spring and not been resecured. The gate at the road was functional, but the bottom hinge had loosened and the gate dragged when swung. She noted it all without writing anything down. The list lived in her head, organized by urgency and sequence, materials and time, the way it had always lived there, in the careful internal ledger her father's instruction had built across 18 years. She walked the main house first, noting the flashing problem at the chimney. Two broken floor joists near the back bedroom that had allowed the flooring to soften, and a window frame on the north side that had racked slightly out of square. The racking was not severe, perhaps a quarter-inch at the top corner, but she pressed her palm flat against the frame and felt the slight bow in the sill and understood it had been worse and had stabilized. That was the kind of detail that told you something about the history of a building, how it had moved and where it had come to rest. None of it was beyond repair. She walked the barn and found the ridgeline sag was the result of a single collar tie that had split and come loose, a half-day's work to replace. The outbuilding was sound but small, useful for storage. She saved the bunkhouse for last. It was a single rectangular room, perhaps 14 feet wide and 22 feet long, with a board floor and log walls chinked with a lime and clay mixture that had held well. A cast-iron stove occupied the near corner. 4 sleeping platforms of rough lumber were built into the walls along the north and east sides, 2 above and 2 below. A narrow door led out to the east. The single west-facing window admitted a band of afternoon light that moved slowly across the floor as she stood there. And in that light she could see a settled layer of dust on every surface. The room had the particular quality she had learned to associate with buildings that had been closed up quickly, rather than cleared out deliberately. A tin cup still sat on the narrow shelf beside the stove, as though someone had set it down, meaning to come back for it. A coil of baling wire hung on a nail beside the door. On one of the lower sleeping platforms, a folded piece of sacking fabric had been left, too small to serve as a bedroll, perhaps a cushion for the hard planks. These small traces of an interrupted life were ordinary enough in abandoned frontier structures. What they told her was simply that the last occupant had left in a hurry or an emergency, not that anything unusual had occurred here. She had seen such traces in a dozen empty buildings across 3 territories. She walked the room's perimeter, knocking lightly on the walls at intervals, the habit so ingrained she had stopped being conscious of doing it. Her father had taught her to listen to walls the way a physician listened to a chest, for the quality of the sound, the resonance, what the knock revealed about what lay behind the surface. Solid log gave a flat, dense return. Hollow space echoed. She knocked along the north wall at shoulder height, then lower, and then at the base. She knocked along the east wall behind the 2 upper sleeping platforms, reaching past the edge of the rough lumber to touch the log surface. At the south wall, roughly centered, she stopped. She knocked again, then once more, moving 6 inches to the left, then 6 to the right. The return from the center section of that south wall was not the sound of solid log. Nora set her palm flat against the chinking and pressed. The lime clay was firm. She looked at the wall surface carefully, her face close to it. And in the afternoon light coming through the west window, she saw what she had not noticed in the general survey of the room. The chinking in the center section of the south wall was slightly newer than the chinking on either side of it. The color was a fraction paler. The texture was marginally smoother. These were small differences, the kind that required looking rather than glancing, and they would have meant nothing to anyone who did not know chinking work. Nora had chinked walls herself at her father's side, beginning at the age of 11. She knew the way lime clay cured and discolored across the seasons. She knew the look of work done in the same year as the surrounding work, and she knew the look of work done later. Someone had opened a section of that south wall and resealed it. She walked back outside to the gray horse and retrieved her pocket knife. She returned to the south wall and began, carefully, to test the chinking in the center section, pressing the blade gently along the seams between the logs where the compound filled the gap. It was solid. The seal had been done properly. She worked along the lower seam of the center section for nearly a foot, and there, at a point roughly 18 inches from the right edge of the section, the blade found a hairline gap where the chinking compound had contracted slightly away from the log face. She widened the gap with the knife tip, slowly, patiently, as her father had once widened a rusted hinge to recover a lock mechanism behind it without breaking the surrounding frame. The chinking came free in a single piece, dried but intact, like a plug withdrawn from a barrel. Behind it was darkness. Behind it was a space roughly 8 inches wide between the interior log face and a second surface set back from it, a wall within a wall. The Clearwater Basin Land Office was run by a clerk named Hobart, a narrow man of 50 or so with an ink stain on his left forefinger that never entirely washed out. He was the kind of man who had worked behind a counter for so long that the counter had become part of him, a surface across which the world presented its problems and against which he measured them for tractability. Nora arrived at his office the following morning with her $12.30 and a question she had been turning over since the previous afternoon. She asked what the Crail place was listed at. Hobart told her the county had put it at $9 for the land and the structures combined, given the condition of the improvements and the grazed-out state of the grass. He said this without particular expression, as though reading a weather report, and she understood from his tone that he expected her to be deterred. The sum itself was not the deterrent. It was modest enough to suggest the county simply wanted the property off its hands. The deterrent he expected her to feel was the condition of the property, the long road out to it, the grazed-out basin grass, the sense that no sensible person would spend $9 on a thing that had already proved too hard for 3 separate families. She had heard that tone before, in supply merchants, in timber brokers, in every transaction in which a woman arrived alone, asking for something that men assumed a woman had no use for. She set $9 on his counter and asked for the deed. He looked at her for a moment, then at the money, then wrote up the transfer without further commentary. The deed was made out in the name of Eleanor V. Voss. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her coat, thanked Hobart, and rode back to the Crail place on the gray horse. The county seat was a 2-hour ride. She had made it in a day, there and back, and it was late afternoon by the time she returned. She lit the stove in the bunkhouse and set water to heat. She ate the biscuits she had bought at the general store in town. She was tired in the way that comes from sustained attention, rather than physical labor, a tiredness behind the eyes. Then she went back to the south wall and went to work in earnest. Her father had owned a set of chinking tools, narrow-bladed and purpose-made, and she had brought 2 of them in the saddlebag on the gray. She used them to clear the center section of the south wall, working from the hairline gap she had opened the previous day and widening outward in both directions, stopping frequently to listen, to feel the tool's resistance and what it told her about what lay behind. The space between the walls was consistent, 8 to 9 inches, and it ran the full width of the center section, perhaps 4 feet across, sealed at top and bottom by the logs themselves. She spent 2 hours clearing the chinking. When she was done, She had a clean rectangular opening, roughly 4 feet wide and 14 inches tall, running between the second and third logs up from the floor. She held her lamp to the opening and looked inside. The space was filled with folded papers. There were also 2 canvas pouches, the kind used for carrying coin, and a slim ledger book with a dark green cover, its spine intact. Everything was wrapped in oilcloth and bound with cord that had dried and stiffened, but not rotted. She reached inside and drew it all out carefully, piece by piece, and set it on the bunkhouse floor in front of the stove. If you have ever felt what it is to find something that was hidden with great care, you know it is not a clean feeling. There is wonder in it, and there is also the weight of whatever need drove the hiding. The hands that sealed this wall had not done so lightly. They had done so in the knowledge that what they sealed needed to survive whatever came next. Nora unwrapped the oilcloth and opened the slim green ledger first. The ledger was a private accounting, written in a careful hand. It covered 7 years, from 1871 to 1878, and it recorded the grazing fees paid to a cattle operation called the Alderton Stock Company by 7 smaller ranching families in the Clearwater Basin, including a man named Elias Crail, who had operated this property, and a man named Reuben Greer, and 5 others whose names Nora did not recognize. The grazing fees were substantial, recorded in neat columns on the left pages, with the corresponding dates of payment and the initials of the receiving party on the right. The receiving party's initials were TVA, repeated across 7 years. Alderton, the Alderton place that had gone under in 1879. Thomas Vernon Alderton. She set the ledger aside and opened the canvas pouches. They contained receipts rather than coin, folded slips of paper that had once been signed by both parties at the time of payment. Each slip named the amount, the date, the payer, and the recipient. She spread them on the floor beside the stove and began to sort through them. And as she sorted, a picture assembled itself from the particular details. The grazing fees recorded in the ledger were not the fees that appeared on the receipts. The amounts on the receipts were uniformly smaller, sometimes by half, sometimes by 2/3. The difference had never been recorded anywhere except in this private ledger, which had been kept by someone who was not Thomas Alderton. The folded papers told the rest of it. There were 12 letters in the bundle, all addressed to a woman named Greta Crail, written in the same careful hand as the ledger. Elias Crail's wife, from the evidence of the letters. The letters were undated, but their content placed them in the final years of the 1870s, overlapping with the end of the ledger's records. They described, without ornament and without self-pity, what had been happening in the basin. Alderton had been collecting grazing fees from the smaller operators under a verbal agreement made in the spring of 1871, when he had first established his operation and had the acreage to accommodate their cattle alongside his own. The agreement was a reasonable one at its inception. The small operators paid Alderton a seasonal fee in exchange for access to his bottomland grass during the dry summer months, when the upland grass on their own acreages went thin. Alderton made the collections himself, by hand, in person, and issued receipts on the spot. What the smaller operators had not known was that Alderton was recording a different number in his own books. The receipts he issued showed the correct amount paid. His internal ledger showed a lower amount received. The difference he was pocketing and attributing to operating expenses in his accounts with the First Bank of Silver Creek, which held paper on the Alderton operation and collected a percentage of the grazing income as part of the loan agreement. In other words, Alderton was defrauding both the bank and his own tenants simultaneously. In one direction, pocketing the difference between what he collected and what he reported to the bank, and in the other direction, holding the smaller operators to a fee arrangement whose written records, if examined, would show them consistently paying less than the agreed amount. If the bank ever called the loan, It could present the receipts against the ledger and claim the smaller operators had been in arrears, even though no arrearage had existed. The verbal agreement would be their only defense. Against a bank and a ledger in Alderton's handwriting, a verbal agreement was nothing. Elias Crail had understood this. The letters to his wife made clear that he had understood it for some time before he died. He had also understood that confronting Alderton directly would accomplish nothing without documentary proof. So he had gathered what proof existed, the receipts he and the other operators had retained, and had kept his own private record in the green ledger, noting every transaction and what it actually reflected, and had hidden it here with the intention of bringing it to the county land office when he had a complete enough picture. He had died before he could do it. The letters said he had been ill in the final months. The last letter broke off mid-sentence. Nora sat on the bunkhouse floor with the papers spread around her and the stove ticking quietly through its iron sides as the fire settled. She was not a woman who permitted herself the luxury of feeling overwhelmed by information. Her father had taught her that a problem revealed is a problem half solved, that the task after discovery is simply the next task, methodical and without dramatics. She sat with it for a time, organizing the papers back into their sequence, reading certain passages again for clarity, and then she put it all back in the oilcloth, tied the cord, and went to bed on one of the bunkhouse sleeping platforms with the bundle under the platform beside her father's chinking tools. She slept soundly. She had done harder things than this. The county land office kept the public records. The First Bank of Silver Creek kept financial records of its own. The Alderton operation had gone under in 1879, which meant its loan records were part of a resolved estate rather than an active account. But resolved estates left paper trails in county archives. Nora spent 3 days in the county seat, at the land office, at the bank, and at the county recorder's office, requesting documents with the quiet persistence of someone who knows what she is looking for and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for it to be produced. She identified herself each time as the owner of the Crail property, which was now factually true, and this gave her standing she would not otherwise have had. The land office records showed the history of the Alderton grazing operation in the basin, the original filing, the extensions, the sale of parcels after the estate dissolution. The county recorder had copies of several grazing agreements from the 1870s, standard form documents that described the general arrangement but not the specific fee amounts. Those amounts, as Elias Crail had understood, lived only in the receipts themselves and in Alderton's private ledger, which his estate had presumably destroyed along with every other inconvenient record. What the public record showed was the gap, the place where a document ought to exist and did not, the absence that only became visible when you knew to look for it. The bank's loan officer was a man named Corvin who wore his watch chain looped to a vest button with practiced precision, and who spoke to Nora in the careful, slightly elevated register that men of his position used when they were trying to be simultaneously respectful and dismissive. She was patient with him. She told him only that she was examining the historical records of grazing arrangements in the Clearwater Basin, and that she had some documents she believed were relevant to the Alderton estate accounts. She did not show him the ledger. She did not show him the receipts. She sat in his office and asked him about the loan structure in plain language until she understood it fully, and then she thanked him and left. The next morning she went to see Reuben Greer. Greer was 61 years old and had been ranching a small piece of land north of the basin for 11 years. He was the only one of the original 7 operators named in Crail's ledger who was still in the basin, the others having sold and moved on after the Alderton business collapsed and the grazing arrangement ended. Greer lived alone in a clean, small house at the end of a lane thick with cottonwoods. and he answered his door in suspenders and a flannel shirt, his face weathered to the color of saddle leather, his eyes quiet and careful. He had the look of a man who had spent a long time paying attention to weather, to animals, to the small signs that told you what was coming before it arrived. He took in Nora's face and her saddlebag and the gray horse tied at his gate with the same quiet appraisal he would have given a change in the cloud formation to the west. She told him who she was. She told him she had bought the Crail property. His expression did not change, but something in it shifted, the way light shifts on still water when a cloud passes over. She asked him if she could come in. He stepped back from the door without speaking, and she came inside, and they sat at his table, and she set the green ledger down between them. She watched his face as he opened it. He was quiet for a long time. He turned the pages slowly, reading the columns. Once he stopped and set his hand flat on the page, his palm covering the figures recorded there, as though the touch could confirm what the eyes were seeing. Outside the window above the table, a pair of sparrows moved through the cottonwoods, and the wind shifted them, and they were gone. Elias kept this, he said finally. His voice was level. Yes, she said. He never told me. He was building the record before he moved on it, Nora said. He did not get the chance. Greer sat back in his chair and looked past her at the wall of his kitchen, at nothing in particular. The clock on the shelf ticked. Outside, a wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water running over stones. The bank held a percentage of the grazing income, he said. I always knew that. What I did not know was that Alderton was reporting a lower number than he collected. The receipts show what you paid, Nora said. His ledger shows what he reported. The difference is significant. Across 7 years, the difference is substantial. Greer turned his head and looked at her directly. His gaze was unhurried and held no performance of any kind, neither suspicion nor warmth, simply the attention of a man who had learned to look at things clearly before he committed to a position. What do you mean to do with it? Set the record straight, she said. Crail hid this because he meant to do exactly that, and he could not finish it. I think it should be finished. Greer was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the ledger, then closed it carefully, running his thumb along the spine to smooth the cover flat. And you want my signature on whatever you bring to the recorder. If you are willing, she said. You are the last of the 7 still here. Your name in the ledger is beside 11 entries. I remember those payments, he said. Everyone. He pushed back his chair and stood and went to the window and looked out at the cottonwood lane for a moment, his hands at his sides. Then he turned around. Bring me what needs signing. The county recorder's office handled property disputes and contract matters of the kind that did not rise to the level of a circuit court case, provided both parties agreed to submit the dispute for administrative review rather than litigation. It was a slower process, but it was also a process available to people who did not have the resources for lawyers and court fees. Nora spent 2 evenings at the Bunkhouse table, drafting the submission, working by lamplight with the green ledger open beside her and the sorted receipts in a neat pile to her left. She wrote in the clear, precise hand her father had insisted she develop, because a carpenter who could not write a legible materials list was a carpenter who would be cheated on supplies. She set out the history of the grazing arrangement, the discrepancy between the receipts and the ledger, the implications for the smaller operators standing in the bank's records, and the documentary basis for each claim. She attached copies of the relevant receipts and referenced the ledger by date range and by the initials of the recording party, which she identified as Thomas Vernon Alderton on the basis of the land office records she had examined in the county seat. She read the submission 3 times before she was satisfied with it, and she was satisfied with it on the same grounds her father had applied to a finished joint. There was nothing to add and nothing that could be removed without losing something necessary. She rode to Greer's house the following morning, and he signed the submission at his kitchen table, using his own pen, without reading it beyond the section that concerned his own entries in the ledger. He folded the document and handed it back to her without comment. The recorder's name was Aldous Finn, a compact man in his late 40s who had held the position for 12 years and who read the submission with the particular stillness of someone who understands exactly what they are reading. He read it twice. He set it down. "These are Alderton's own records," he said. "Crale's transcription, yes," she said, "with the original receipts to verify. And you found this in the Crale property." "In the south wall of the bunkhouse," she said, "sealed behind the chinking." Fenn looked at the submission again for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You have a knowledge of construction, Miss Vass." "My father was a carpenter," she said. "I worked with him for 18 years. He nodded slowly as though this explained something that had been nagging at him. Then he turned the submission over in his hands, weighing it in the practical sense of a man who knew what its existence represented. "I will need to review these with the bank's representative," he said, "and I will need to contact the other parties whose names appear in this record, or their estates if they are no longer living. This will take some time." "I expect it will," Nora said. She rode back to the Crale place in the long light of a late October afternoon, the basin spread around her in shades of dry gold and the pale gray of exhausted grass. The gray horse moved steadily on the road, his hooves raising small puffs of dust at each step. The wind that was always in the basin moved through the sage and bunch grass along the road's edge and made a low, continuous sound. She had $3 and some cents left of her original 12. The deed was in her coat pocket. She had repair work ahead of her that would take most of the winter, starting with the barn collar tie and working through to the main house roof before the worst of the cold arrived. She had a single canvas bag of flour, some salt, a supply of beans, and a ham hock she had bought in town. She had her father's 2 chinking tools, and the pocket knife and the gray horse, whose name she had decided was Chance, because that was what he was. The repair of the barn collar tie took most of a day. Working alone with rope and a block and tackle she fashioned from materials in the barn itself. The tie had been a good piece of Douglas fir at its installation, straight-grained and dense, and it had split along a knot inclusion that had been invisible from outside. She cut a replacement from a sound length of timber she found in the outbuilding, a piece left over from some earlier construction project and stored against need. She shaped the new tie with a handsaw and a draw knife she found hanging in the barn, dulled but useful once she had sharpened it on a whetstone from the same collection of abandoned tools. The ridgeline responded as she had expected it would, settling back to plumb once the pressure was restored to the joint. She stood in the barn below it when the work was done and looked up the length of the ridgepole and felt the satisfaction of a structural problem properly solved, which was a clean and specific satisfaction. Nothing like the feeling of surprise or triumph, simply the recognition of a thing set right. She spent the following 3 days on the main house roof, her body braced against the pitch, working the flashing back to its proper seal with hammer and tin shears. The tin she cut from a length of sheet metal she found rolled up in the outbuilding, slightly corroded but serviceable. The chimney flashing had lifted at its top edge, allowing water to track behind it along the vertical face of the stone, and it had been lifting long enough that the wood below it had absorbed moisture and begun to soften. She cut out the softened wood with a chisel, let the exposed area dry for a day in the autumn sun, and then sealed it with a pine pitch compound she rendered from resin she collected from the pines along the road. Her father had taught her that compound. He had learned it himself from an old German carpenter in Nebraska, who had maintained it was the most reliable roofing sealant known to man, superior to any commercial preparation, because it moved with the wood rather than resisting it. She applied it carefully and reflashed over it, and the repair was as solid as the original construction. She repointed the south wall of the bunkhouse from scratch, using the same lime clay mixture she mixed herself from materials she found in the outbuilding, where a previous occupant had stored lime and a bag of dried clay. The new chinking was slightly paler than the old, as it always was, and she knew it would darken to match across the first winter. She did not fill the interior cavity. She left the space open, that 8-inch channel between the walls, accessible now from the small opening she had resealed from the inside with a piece of board cut to fit and held with 2 square-head nails. A person who did not know to look for it would not find it. She thought it was useful to have a place where things of importance could be kept safe. Fenn's letter reached her in late November, delivered by a county rider who appeared on the road to the Crail place on a gray Tuesday morning. She read it inside the bunkhouse with the stove going and a cup of coffee at her elbow. The review had gone as the documents warranted. The bank had examined the Alderton estate records against the receipts in the green ledger and had found a discrepancy of $742 across the 7-year period of the arrangement, representing the difference between what Alderton had collected and what he had reported. Alderton himself was 5 years dead, his estate settled and dispersed, which meant there was no direct recovery from him. What remained was the question of the standing of the smaller operators in the bank's historical records, and on that question, the bank, under some pressure from Fenn's office, had agreed to amend the records to reflect the payments as the receipts showed them, rather than as the ledger had misrepresented them. This meant that the records of the operators who had paid in full, as their retained receipts showed they had, would no longer carry the notional discrepancy that Alderton's false accounting had created. It resolved nothing in cash terms. It resolved everything in terms of the record. There was a second paragraph in Fenn's letter. It said that Reuben Greer had written separately to the recorder's office, in his own name, naming Nora Vass as the person who had recovered the documents and submitted the claim, and requesting that this be entered in the administrative record of the proceeding. Fenn had done so. The entry would remain in the county files as long as the files existed. She set the letter on the table and drank her coffee. Outside the bunkhouse window, the first real snow of the season was beginning, not the light dusting of the weeks before, but a proper fall, thick and straight in the still air. It came down past the window glass in the silence that snowfall makes, which is not the absence of sound, but a different kind of presence, dense and patient. 2 days later, on a morning when the snow had settled to a foot on the level and the sky had cleared to a hard blue, Reuben Greer rode down the 2-rut road to the Crail place on his roan horse and knocked on the bunkhouse door. He had a coil of wire on his saddle and 2 fence staples in his coat pocket, and he said without preamble that he had noted her north fence line was down in 2 places, and that he had extra wire and could spare a morning. She looked at him for a moment, then stepped back from the door and told him there was coffee on the stove. They spent the morning on the fence line, working from opposite ends of the downed section toward each other, the wire stiff in the cold and their breath visible in the clear air. He knew what he was doing with wire, and she did not need to instruct him and did not try. When the last staple was set, they stood for a moment in the mid-morning light, the basin laid out below them from this higher ground, the ridgeline to the west holding its new coat of snow, the gray horse standing in the near pasture with his head low, grazing through the snow cover to the dry grass beneath. "The grass will come back," Greer said, looking out across the basin. "It will," she said. She had assessed the soil in 3 places across the property and found it tired but not ruined. A couple of years of rest, managed grazing and rotation would bring it back. She had already planned the rotation. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man who has looked at land for a long time and can read what it is capable of. Then he gathered his remaining wire and returned to his horse. She watched him ride north up the road until the cottonwoods along the creek bed took him from view. Then she turned and looked at the bunkhouse, the sound structure of it, the log walls well seated, the roof carrying its weight of snow without complaint, the single window reflecting the flat white light of the basin in winter. She went inside and hung her coat. She moved the green ledger from under the sleeping platform to the shelf above the stove, where she could see it. She had no use for it as evidence any longer. What it had served. It was a record of a man's careful attention and a woman's refusal to leave it buried, and it belonged on a shelf where it could be seen. The stove ticked. The snow had begun again outside the window, fine and soft this time, the kind that fell without wind and settled without drama. Chance stood in the near pasture with his back to the weather, indifferent to it. In the spring, when the basin grass greened up in patches along the wet ground near the creek, Nora set out her fence posts for the rotation system she had planned across the winter and began the slow work of making the Crail land into something that could support itself. She worked alone most days, and she worked steadily, in the manner her father had passed to her, moving from task to task without haste and without waste, giving the work its full measure, and then stopping for the night, the thing that her father had told her once, when she was perhaps 14, and had asked why he took such care with structures that other people might demolish in 30 years, was this: that a building tells the truth about the person who built it, not about the person who commissions it or the person who owns it, but about the hands that put it together, and that if you built it honestly, it would outlast every lie anyone told about it. She had not known then how fully she would come to understand that. The gray horse Chance proved out as reliable as Packard had implied, carrying her over difficult ground without complaint, through that first winter and the spring beyond it. She kept him well. He had cost her a fast horse and $6, and had given her, in some fair accounting of these things, considerably more. The basin grass came back as she had expected it would, not quickly and not easily, but the way things came back in that country, slowly and without announcement. The green appearing first in the low places where water collected in spring, then spreading up the slopes as the season progressed. By the second summer, the pasture nearest the creek was carrying color through August, which it had not done in years. The neighbors who came over the following autumn, including Reuben Greer and a farming couple named Silas and May Dowd, who had filed on a piece of land 2 miles east, stood at the fence line and looked at the grass without saying much. There was not much to say. The grass said it. The Crail place, which the county record would presently list as the Vass property, was 41 acres in the Clearwater Basin of southern Montana Territory, purchased for $9 in the autumn of 1883 by a woman who had arrived on the back of a borrowed gray horse with $12, a pocket knife, and a father's knowledge of what walls will tell you if you know how to listen. The green ledger remained on the shelf above the stove. The chinking tools hung on their peg beside the door. The south wall of the bunkhouse held its new clay, paler than the logs on either side of it, but sound, sealed against the weather. Honest work that would darken in time to match what surrounded it. The basin wind moved through the sage outside the window the way it always had, steady and unhurried, and the stove ticked, and the country did what country does, which is to say it persisted, and so did she.